She was sold to a stranger. But in Dust Haven she found her freedom and true love. Under the burning sun of Texas, in the year 1881, Dust Haven was a place where the wind carried secrets, and men carried debts like chains that rattled long after dark. The streets were dry and crooked, lined with saloons that stank of spilled whiskey and card tables where fortunes were lost quicker than they were won. Clara Whitfield walked with her father through the dust of Main Street, her hand trembling around the handle of a worn carpetbag. She had not wanted to come, but her father's grip was hard on her arm and his voice harsher still when he whispered that this was the only way to save the family name. She had heard those words before, when he sold off their horse, when he mortgaged the roof above their heads, when he bartered away her brother's future for another hand of cards. Now he was bartering her. The chapel at the edge of town was small and pale, its wood sun bleached, its windows streaked with dust. A preacher waited inside with a Bible clutched to his chest, his eyes avoiding hers, as if he too knew what was wrong, but had no strength to say it aloud. At the front stood Colton Reeves, the man who was to be her husband. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, his black coat neat against the frame of a man who had lived too long in the saddle. His face was weathered, his jaw marked with lines that told of years that hardened him, years that others whispered about in the saloon. They called him an outlaw once, a gunman who had ridden with men feared across counties, a man whose name was spoken with caution. Now he stood in the house of God, a rancher with land enough to feed a town, waiting for a bride who had no choice but to stand beside him. Clara's dress was not new. It had once been her mother's. The lace was yellow with age, the hem frayed, and though she tried to hold her chin high, her heart pounded like hooves against the earth. She looked at her father, who leaned against the pew with whiskey on his breath, his eyes cold as stone. He gave her a sharp nod, the kind that said, "Do not fail me now." Clara swallowed the bitterness that rose in her throat. She had always known her father cared more for dice than for daughters. The preacher cleared his throat, his voice echoing in the hollow space. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." The words rolled like stones across the floor. Clara heard them, but did not feel them. She watched Colton. He did not smile, but neither did he sneer. His eyes were steady, the color of storm clouds that held both danger and rain. When the preacher asked if she would take this man, the silence stretched, heavy and thick. Clara felt every eye in the room pressing against her skin. She thought of running, but there was nowhere to go. She thought of screaming, but no one would hear her. So she spoke low, her voice trembling, "I do." Colton's answer came calm, almost quiet, as if the weight of the words pressed on him as much as they pressed on her. "I do." The vows were spoken, the rings exchanged, and just like that, Clara Whitfield became Clara Reeves. The town would say it was a fine bargain, that debts were paid, that a girl without a dowry had found a husband with land and power. But as Clara stood beside him, her hand cold in his, she did not feel saved. She felt bound, tied not by love but by chains made of promises she had never chosen. And in the still air of Dust Haven, with the sun beating against the chapel roof, she made a vow of her own, silent and burning. Someday she would not be a pawn on her father's table or a prize in another man's hand. Someday she would claim a life of her own, even if it cost her everything. The house that belonged to Colton Reeves stood against the edge of the plains, a wide structure of stone and timber that looked more like a fortress than a home. Clara crossed its threshold on the first night of her marriage, her face set with defiance, her heart beating like a trapped bird. She did not look at him as he carried her trunk through the door. She did not thank him. And when he set it down in the upstairs room, she turned the key in the lock and shut him out. The sound of the bolt sliding into place echoed down the hall like the crack of a whip. That night, she sat on the edge of the bed in the dim light of a single candle, her hands clenched around her skirt, her stomach knotted with hunger she refused to admit. Below she heard him moving about, the heavy steps of boots across the floor, the scrape of a chair pulled out, the faint clink of cutlery against a plate. The smell of food drifted up, roasted meat and bread, the sort of meal she had not seen at her father's table in months. Still, she stayed where she was, cold and silent, staring at the wall until the candle burned down to nothing. Morning came with the cry of roosters and the sound of Colton already awake. Clara rose stiffly, her eyes sore from a night without rest. When she opened the door, the hall was empty, the air still carrying the faint scent of coffee. On the floor at her feet lay a book, its cover worn, its spine cracked from use. She picked it up, saw the title written in faded letters, A Story of Women Who Defied the Lives Chosen for Them. Clara scoffed, dropped it back on the floor, and walked away. The days that followed fell into a rhythm of silence. Clara stayed in her room through meals, locking the door whenever she heard his steps in the hall. When he knocked once to ask if she needed anything, she ignored him until his shadow moved away. At night she heard him tending the fire, polishing his boots, speaking in low tones to his horse outside the barn as if he found more comfort in the animal than in her. He never raised his voice, never rattled her door, never demanded she join him. That quiet unnerved her more than any anger might have. On the fourth night, she found another book at her door, this one newer, its pages crisp. She picked it up and tossed it onto the dresser without opening it, telling herself she would not fall into his games. Yet, as the hours dragged on and sleep would not come, she found her eyes straying toward it, again and again. She finally opened the cover and saw a note slipped between the first pages. "You do not have to like me," it read, "but I hope you keep reading." Signed only with the initials C.R. Clara pressed her lips together and closed the book, her pulse quickening, though she did not know why. She set it aside and blew out the lamp, telling herself she would not read another word. But when dawn touched the horizon and she sat awake in her bed, the book lay open across her lap, her finger tracing the lines of a story that spoke of strength she had long buried. Downstairs, Colton Reeves poured his coffee, the sound of the cup on wood carrying faintly through the house. Clara listened, and though the door remained locked, a thread she had not expected began to pull at the silence between them. The nights in Dusthaven stretched long, the kind that made every board in the house creak and every gust of wind sound like a whisper at the window. Clara lay awake in her room, the book Colton had left for her still resting open on the table beside the bed. She had read more than she planned, her eyes burning from candlelight, yet her mind would not rest. She heard the low murmur of movement below, a chair scraping, boots shifting against the floor. For a moment she thought he had gone to bed, but then came a sound she did not expect, his voice carrying softly through the cracks of the old wood. It was not the voice of a man giving orders or defending himself in town. It was a voice stripped bare, quiet and rough, as if he was speaking to someone who could never answer. Clara rose, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders, and pressed her ear to the door. She caught pieces of words, fragments that drifted upward. He spoke of debts that no money could repay, of blood on his hands, of nights when the weight of the pistol at his side felt heavier than the world. He mentioned names she did not know, and one that he spoke with a softness that stilled her heart: Mary. Clara pressed her palm against the door, her breath held tight in her chest. She heard him pause, then speak again, telling the horse in the barn how Mary had been his wife once, how she had lived only 3 years at his side before the fever took her in winter. His voice broke then, a sound raw and quiet, not the cry of a man, but the ache of one who had learned to bury grief so deep it could never fully die. Clara's throat tightened, and she turned away from the door, unsettled by the truth that slipped free when he thought no one heard. The next morning she faced him at the table for the first time. She had come down only to fetch water, but he was already there with a cup of coffee in his hand. His eyes met hers, and for the briefest instant, she saw the same storm she had heard in his voice the night before. He said nothing, only pushed the pot closer, as if to offer her a cup, but she shook her head and walked past. Still, the sound of his confession clung to her like dust, impossible to shake off. That night the pattern repeated. She waited until the house was quiet, and the lamp downstairs burned low, then crept to the edge of the stairs. Again she heard him, speaking to the dark, telling the walls of the men he had shot, of the children who had cried in the towns he once rode through, of the shame that never left him. Even when he put the gun away, and bought his first herd of cattle. Clara's hand gripped the rail, her heart pounding. He was not only the man her father had traded her to, not only the outlaw the town feared. He was a man torn open by ghosts, carrying sorrow that bled through even his silence. When she returned to her room, she sat in the dark for a long while, her eyes stinging with tears she did not expect. She did not forgive him, she did not even understand him, but for the first time she wondered if there was more to Colton Reeves than the shadow her father had forced her to follow. In the stillness, she made a quiet vow that she would listen before she judged, that she would learn the truth before deciding if he was a jailer or a man worth standing beside. And as the night wind rattled the shutters, Clara lay down, her heart restless, haunted now, not only by her own chains, but by the ghosts she had heard walking beside him. The storm rolled across Dusthaven like a beast unchained, its winds screaming through the valley, its rain hammering against the roof of the Reeves house until it seemed the boards would split apart. Clara sat in her room with her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, listening to the thunder rattle the panes of glass. She had tried to read, but the words blurred, her mind too unsettled by the storm outside and the storm inside her own chest. Every time the walls shuddered, she thought of the weight of the sky pressing down, and though she wanted to stay behind the locked door, something drew her to stand and listen. Below, she heard Colton moving about, his boots striking the floor in steady, measured steps. A crack sounded from above her head, sharp as a gunshot. Clara gasped, looking up just as the ceiling beam groaned under the weight of the storm. Dust fell like rain across the floorboards, and without thinking, she pulled the door open and ran into the hall. Colton was already climbing the stairs, his shirt damp from the rain that had seeped in. His eyes narrowed as he looked at the sagging timber. He did not ask her why she had come out of her room. He only shouted for her to bring her hands to the brace as he shoved his shoulder against the wood. The beam groaned again, the sound like bones breaking. Clara pressed her palms against the brace, her body straining beside his as they fought to push it back into place. Rainwater spilled through the crack, soaking her sleeves, and for the first time she felt his strength not as something to fear, but as something she leaned into. His arm brushed hers, their breaths ragged and harsh, his voice rough in her ear as he urged her to hold steady. Together they pushed, the storm raging above them, and at last the beam shifted back into its place with a thud that echoed through the house. They staggered back, both gasping, both soaked with sweat and rain. For a moment, Clara leaned against the wall, her hair clinging to her face, her heart thundering for more than just the effort. She looked at him, saw the way his chest rose and fell, the way his jaw was set not in anger, but in determination. He met her gaze for a brief second, something unspoken passing between them. Then he looked away, adjusting the brace one last time before stepping back. The silence that followed was different than the silence of locked doors and cold meals. It was heavy but not empty, full of the breath they had shared and the strength they had lent each other. Clara felt it as clearly as she felt the storm easing outside, the thunder rolling further away, the rain softening against the roof. She pulled her shawl tighter, her fingers trembling, and turned to leave. But her steps were slower now, as if she carried something new within her. That night she did not lock her door. She left it closed, but the bolt remained untouched. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening as Colton moved about the house, his boots steady, his hands working at the fire, his voice low as he spoke to himself in words she could not catch. She did not rise, she did not speak, but she did not turn the key. For the first time since her wedding day, she let the air between them stay open, just wide enough for something to pass through. It was not trust, not yet, but it was a crack, small and fragile, like the break in the beam that had forced them together. And as the storm rolled away into the night, Clara closed her eyes and wondered if all walls, no matter how high, could begin to fall the same way, with just a single crack. The heat of late afternoon lay heavy over Dusthaven, the kind that made the air shimmer above the ground and left sweat clinging to every man who walked the street. Clara rode into town with Colton at her side, her heart pounding faster than the horse beneath her. In her hand she clutched a letter, its edges smudged with dirt and fear. Her brother's name had been scrawled across it, and inside the words told of trouble he could not escape. He had crossed the gamblers who already held her father's debts, and now they wanted blood to settle what money could not. Clara had begged Colton to take her, and though he said little, the hard set of his jaw told her he would not let her face it alone. The main road of Dusthaven was alive with noise, poker tables spilling onto porches, cowhands shouting as they stumbled out of the saloon, the metallic clink of spurs striking wood. Clara felt eyes following her as she dismounted, whispers rising like dust around her name. They all remembered the day she married Colton, how she had been given away like payment, how she had stood with defiance in her eyes even as vows were spoken. Now she was back, not as a bride to be pitied, but as a sister fighting for her own. Her father was there, standing outside the saloon with a bottle in one hand and a sneer curling across his lips. His face was red from whiskey, his vest stained with sweat. The gamblers stood with him, 3 men lean and mean, their hats pulled low, their hands resting too close to the revolvers at their belts. Clara stepped forward, the letter shaking in her grasp. "Where is he?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut through the noise. The older gambler laughed, the sound hollow as a rattlesnake's warning. "Your brother ran up a debt he cannot pay. A lesson needs to be taught, girl." He reached for her arm, but stopped when Colton moved between them, his presence as solid as the earth beneath their boots. Colton's hand rested near his gun, though he did not draw. His voice was calm but filled with gravel. "No lesson will be taught today." The crowd grew, men leaning against posts, women peering from behind curtains, the whole town drawn by the tension. Her father spat on the ground, glaring at Colton with eyes full of hate. "Do not forget what you are, Reeves. A killer, an outlaw who bought my daughter like cattle." Clara's breath caught, shame flashing across her face, but Colton did not flinch. He looked at the men and then at her, his words carrying clear for all to hear. "I bought nothing. I gave her a choice. That is more than you ever gave her." When of the scrape, a hush fell over the street. Clara's throat tightened as she looked at the faces of the townsfolk, seeing doubt flicker where once there had only been gossip. She found her voice, steady and firm. "He speaks the truth. My father sold me as if I were a sack of grain, but Colton gave me a way to stand on my own." The gamblers shifted, uneasy under the weight of her words. One muttered that the trouble was not worth it and backed away, then another followed. Her father cursed, raising his hand as if to strike her, but Colton's voice cut through like thunder. "You lay one hand on her again, and you will find no soul in this town willing to stand with you." The silence that followed was heavy and final. No one moved to help her father. No one spoke his name in defense. He lowered his hand, muttered beneath his breath, and stumbled back into the saloon, swallowed by the smoke and noise. Clara's knees trembled, but she stood tall, her chest rising with breath she had not realized she had been holding. Colton turned to her, his eyes steady, asking without words if she was all right. She nodded, though her heart still raced. Around them the town began to shift, whispers turning to stares. Stares to something like respect. Dusthaven had seen blood threatened that day, but what it truly saw was the beginning of something far stronger than fear. The night was cool after the heat of the day, the kind of cool that carried the smell of dust settling and wood smoke rising. Clara sat on the porch with her shawl wrapped tight, the events of the afternoon still clinging to her like burrs. She could still see the gambler's eyes, the way her father had lifted his hand against her, the way Colton had stood in front of her like a wall that could not be moved. She had spoken out in front of the whole town, her voice strong even as her heart quaked, and though her knees trembled, she had not fallen. For the first time she felt as if the people of Dusthaven had seen her not as property, but as a woman with a voice of her own. Colton came out from the barn, his boots slow against the dirt, his broad shoulders shadowed by the firelight spilling from the open door. He did not sit at first, only leaned against the porch rail, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the last of the sunset bled into the hills. Clara turned her eyes away, uncertain if she wanted to speak, uncertain if she wanted silence. The air between them was thick, charged with everything that had happened, until Colton broke it with a voice low and rough. "I was not always a man worth standing beside," he said. His hands braced against the rail. His words startled her more than any sudden noise could have. He had spoken more in that one sentence than in the last week combined. She did not answer, only waited. He drew a breath, steady but hard, and went on. "I rode with men who carried pistols for payment. We took what was not ours. I shot men down in streets not much different from this one. And every time I told myself it was for survival, that it was the life given to me. But the truth is, I chose it." Clara's chest tightened. She had heard whispers of his past, but hearing it from his own mouth was different, heavier, like stones placed in her hands. He still did not look at her. His voice grew quieter, the firelight catching in his eyes as if it burned through memories he wished would stay buried. "I married once, before all of this. Her name was Mary. She was young and kind, and I thought giving her a roof and food would be enough. But I never asked her what she wanted, never gave her a life beyond the walls of my own making." She smiled less and less, until one winter night she stopped smiling altogether. The fever came, and by the time the doctor arrived, she was gone. I buried her myself, with my own hands in frozen earth. And I swore that if I ever took a wife again, it would not be by force, it would not be by debt, it would not be without her having the chance to walk away if she wished. His shoulders sagged then, as though the weight of the truth had at last been spoken and left him hollow. Clara's eyes stung, though she tried to hold back the heat rising behind them. She had expected cruelty when she was given to him, had expected to be caged. Yet now she saw a man already living inside his own prison, haunted by the mistakes of the past and the grave of a woman who had never been given a choice. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out the small handkerchief her mother had left her. Its edges frayed, its stitching faded. She set it on the rail beside his hand. He looked at it, then at her, his mouth opening slightly as if words might come, but none did. The firelight flickered. The night stretched quiet, and together they stood in that silence, two souls marked by loss, beginning, at last, to share the weight. The moon rose pale over Dust Haven, its light spilling across the crooked roofs and dusty streets. The saloon was alive with noise, the kind that carried well into the night. Laughter and shouting, dice clattering against tables, glasses slamming down in drunken rhythm. Clara stood at the edge of town, with her shawl pulled tight and her jaw set hard. She had left the ranch without a word, her heart pounding with the plans she had carried like fire in her chest. She was done hiding behind locked doors and whispered fears. Her father's debts were written in ledgers that chained not only her family, but half the town, and tonight she meant to see them burn. She moved through the shadows, her steps light against the dirt, her face hidden beneath a scarf. To any passerby, she would look like just another girl slipping into the saloon, one more shadow swallowed by the smoke and the stink of whiskey. Inside, the noise pressed against her ears. Men shouting over games, boots scraping across the floor, the piano pounding out a tune that faltered when the keys stuck. She kept her head down, weaving through the crowd until she reached the back hallway where the noise dimmed, and the smell of paper and ink drifted from the room beyond. The door was cracked, the lamplight spilling out onto the floor. She slipped inside, her breath held tight. The shelves were stacked with books, ledgers bound in leather, pages marked with names and numbers, lives measured in debts and losses. Clara's hands shook as she pulled the tin of kerosene from her bag and began to pour, the liquid spreading across the floorboards, soaking into the spines of the books. The smell was sharp and bitter, filling her nose until her eyes watered. She struck a match, her fingers trembling, the flame sputtering before it caught. For a moment she stared at it, her mind screaming that there was no turning back. Then she dropped it into the pool of kerosene and stepped away as fire rushed to life, leaping and crackling, licking at the pages that had bound her family in silence for too long. The roar of men filled the hall before she reached the door. One grabbed her wrist, his grip rough as iron, jerking her back into the room. She twisted, kicked, clawed, But more hands closed around her, dragging her into the saloon where smoke was already curling through the air. Voices rose in anger. Curses spat as the flames spread. Her father shoved through the crowd, his face red, his eyes wild. "You again," he bellowed, spittle flying as he glared at her. "You'll ruin me, girl." He raised his hand to strike, but the room froze when the front doors banged open. Colton Reeves stepped inside, his broad frame filling the doorway, the firelight flickering across his face. He did not shout. He did not draw his pistol. He only walked forward, with steady steps, his gaze sweeping the room until no man dared move. His voice cut through the noise, calm and heavy as stone. "If you were men, you would not let a girl risk her life to undo the shame you profit from." His eyes fixed on Clara's father. "And if you lay one hand on her again, you will find yourself with no friend left in this town." The crowd shifted, uneasy, glancing at one another. One by one, men backed away, muttering that it was not worth it. Her father's face twisted with rage, but no one stood beside him. Smoke thickened, the fire crackling louder from the back room. Colton reached for Clara, his hand firm but steady, pulling her free from the circle of hands that had trapped her. She stumbled into his side, her breath ragged, her heart hammering, but she stood tall. She had not come here to be saved. She had come to fight, and as they stepped into the night air together, Clara knew she had done just that. The dawn after the fire was slow to rise, the sky painted in pale streaks of pink and gray, the air heavy with the smell of smoke that had drifted from the saloon all through the night. Clara stood on the porch of the Reeves ranch, her shawl slipping from her shoulders, her hair tangled from wind and ash. She had not slept, her mind replaying every moment, from the match sparking to the flames leaping, to the faces of men who had grabbed her, to the steady steps of Colton walking through the firelight like judgment itself. She had gone into that saloon with her own will, and though she had nearly been dragged down, she had not broken. For the first time in her life, she felt something sharp and fierce to take root inside her, a sense that she was no longer anyone's pawn. By noon, word had spread across Dust Haven, faster than any flame could run. People whispered on street corners, in the churchyard, over the counters of the store. Some said she was reckless, some called her foolish, but more than a few spoke of her with a note of awe. They said the Whitfield girl had stood against her father, had set fire to the books that bound half the town, had walked out alive when no one else would have dared. Clara heard the whispers when she went into town to fetch water, felt the eyes following her, and instead of lowering her gaze, she lifted her chin higher. She was tired of shrinking, tired of carrying shame that was never hers to bear. Colton walked beside her that afternoon, silent as always, his hat low over his brow, his steps measured. Yet when men nodded at him with something like respect, when women glanced at Clara with eyes less sharp than before, she saw the way his shoulders eased just slightly. At the well, a woman she had known as a girl pressed a loaf of bread into her hands without a word. Clara clutched it to her chest, her throat tightening, not from hunger, but from the weight of being seen at last for more than her father's debts. That evening they sat on the porch as the light faded, Colton whittling a small piece of wood, while Clara held the bread untouched in her lap. The quiet stretched between them until she spoke, her voice firm though her hands shook. "I did not stay because I had to," she said. "I stayed because I wanted to. And today I burned more than paper. I burned the hold he had over me." Colton set down the knife, his dark eyes meeting hers without flinching. "I never wanted you bound by him or by me," he said, his voice low. "If you walk beside me, it should be because it is what you choose." Clara looked at him, the fireflies sparking in the grass beyond the porch, the smell of sage drifting on the evening wind. For the first time she reached out, her hand finding his. It was not a plea for safety, not a surrender, but a declaration. "Then hear me now," she whispered. "I choose this. I choose to stand. And I choose to stand with you." The silence that followed was not empty, it was full. A quiet that wrapped around them like the warm dark of summer. Colton did not answer with words, only tightened his rough hand around hers, steady and sure. Clara leaned back against the porch rail, her shoulders straight, her head high. She was no longer the girl bartered for whiskey and debts. She was the woman who had faced fire and walked out stronger. And in the hush of night, with the stars kindling overhead, she knew she would never bow her head again. The days that followed were filled with work from the first light of dawn until the stars returned. Clara rose early, pulling on boots that were already worn at the toes, her hair braided back and tucked under her scarf. She walked to the barn where the smell of hay and horse sweat clung thick in the air. The ranch hands watched her at first with suspicion, muttering that a woman who had come from town in a wedding dress had no place with a pitchfork in her hands, but Clara did not falter. She shoveled stalls until her arms ached, carried water until her back screamed, and when a calf was born, in the chill of morning, she knelt beside it without hesitation, her dress smeared with mud and blood as she coaxed it to stand. By the end of the week, one of the men tipped his hat to her, and another offered a quiet nod. She did not need their approval, but it warmed her more than the sun on her skin. At night, Clara sat at the kitchen table, her sleeves rolled to the elbow. A small ledger opened before her. Numbers lined the page, neat and careful, every feed sack and fence post accounted for. She had learned to keep track of such things when her father squandered coin at the saloon, and now that skill gave her something to offer. Colton noticed the change one evening, his eyes falling on the figures she had written. He said nothing, only left a new fountain pen at her place the next morning. Clara touched it with her fingers, the weight of it delicate yet firm, and felt an odd tightness in her chest. The rhythm of their days became something steady, like the beat of hooves across the plain. Colton worked with the cattle and rode the fences, while Clara mended clothes, baked bread, and balanced the ranch accounts. When the day's chores ended, they often found themselves on the porch together. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they did not, but the silence between them no longer felt like a wall. He whittled figures from scraps of wood, small horses and birds, while she read aloud from the books he had left at her door in those first lonely weeks. Once she set a book aside and found a carved sparrow resting near her chair, its wings smoothed by his steady hands. She turned it over in her palm, and when her eyes lifted to his, she saw not the outlaw the town feared, but a man trying to build something lasting. The land was still harsh, the drought had not yet lifted, and the fences broke as fast as they were mended. Yet there was a different weight in the air, less heavy, more shared. Clara no longer felt as if she lived inside another man's shadow. Each task she took on stitched her more firmly into the fabric of the ranch, and each evening she chose to remain at Colton's side was her own decision, not forced by debt or fear. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in strokes of gold and rust, Clara looked at the ranch spread before her, the corrals, the cattle, the fields stretching beyond the horizon. Her hands were rough now, calloused from work, but they were steady. She turned to Colton, who sat sharpening a blade by the light of the fire, and she realized she was no longer waiting for freedom to find her. She was building it, piece by piece, day by day. The thought settled in her chest like a promise, and for the first time since leaving her father's house, she allowed herself to breathe without fear. The spring sun rose gentle over Dust Haven, soft and golden, carrying with it the scent of earth waking after long sleep. The land, once cracked and gray, now showed hints of green, small shoots of grass pushing through the soil, wildflowers daring to bloom along the fence posts. Clara stood at the new house on the far edge of the ranch, the one she and Colton had built together. The walls still smelled of fresh wood, the windows wide and bright, the porch wrapped around like open arms. She ran her fingers along the railing, feeling the smooth grain beneath her touch, and breathed deep. This was not a house given to her, not a roof forced upon her. This was a home she had chosen, every nail and beam a piece of her will. Colton came from the barn with his hat in his hand, his shirt rolled at the sleeves, his boots dusted with the morning's work. He carried himself with the same steady weight he always had, yet there was something lighter in the way his mouth almost curved when his eyes met hers. Clara stepped down to meet him, her skirt brushing against her boots, and together they knelt to plant the small rose bush beneath the porch window. Its roots were tangled but strong, its buds shy but ready. As she patted the soil firm around it, she smiled. "They fight," she said softly. "They bloom in spite of thorns." Colton nodded as if the words made perfect sense. Later that week, the townsfolk gathered at the little white chapel down the road. It was not like the first time she had stood there, trembling with fury and shame. This time there was no debt, no barter, no whispers of scandal clinging to her dress. She wore no veil, only a simple gown with a sprig of rosemary tucked in her hair. Colton stood beside her in the same black coat he had worn before, but now his face was not shadowed and unreadable. It was open, steady, filled with light. The preacher spoke words she had heard once already, yet this time every syllable carried weight. When it came time for vows, she did not hesitate. She took Colton's hands, rough and scarred from years of work, and looked him in the eyes. "I used to think I was something passed between men," she said, her voice clear enough for every soul in that chapel to hear. "A trade, a burden, a coin in another man's pocket. But then you stood still and you waited. You let me choose. And from this day forward, I am no longer the girl who was given away. I am the woman who chose." The chapel filled with silence, then with the sound of hands clapping, boots stamping, and voices rising in joy. Outside the bells rang, and under the wide Texas sky, Clara Reeves stepped into her life not as a bargain, but as a bride who had claimed her own story. She turned to Colton, laughter trembling on her lips, and whispered, "Now, if you ever leave your boots in the kitchen again, I might just unchoose you." He chuckled low, and together, they walked into the sunlight. If this tale touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Western Love Legends. Leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. There are many more stories of courage and love on the frontier waiting to be told. After all, out here in the West, bullets might miss, but hearts surely do not.